We get started on Dharma talk. Please join me in invoking the Buddha's name 3 times. Namo Shakyamuni Buddha. Namo Shakyamuni Buddha. Namo Shakyamuni Buddha. Good evening, everyone. So we've spent 5 classes discussing the types of sutras, the kinds of sutras, the clarification of sutras. And so we finally get to the point where we are nearing the actual sutra itself. I think this class I will discuss the 6 requirements of a sutra. So every sutra must have these 6 requirements in order to be validated as a sutra. And I'll be discussing Ananda's 4 questions to the Buddha. And I think next class, one more class, and I'll talk about some of the, well, never mind. This class will start with the actual sutra. So I put in the first half of the paragraph of the, first section, half of the first section of the Amitabha Sutra, because that's all that I need to cover for today. So we've finally started on the sutra itself. And so most sutras are usually divided into 3 parts. There's always the preface or the foreword. Sometimes it's called the principle proper, or also called the prologue, and the transmission, or also called the postscript. So preface, principle proper, and transmission. These are the 3 divisions of, or 3 parts of all sutras. And so the very beginning of all sutras is always the preface, the foreword. And it describes what's happening, what's going on, right? The general meaning is what the preface is talking about. And so in the Amitabha Sutra, well, in all sutras really, but this is specifically taken from the Amitabha Sutra. As we read sutras, the translation of these first few words, thus I have heard, at one time the Buddha dwelt at Shravasi, it'll vary according to tradition and translation, but generally speaking, it all comes down to, thus I have heard, at one time the Buddha dwelt at wherever he was, with the assembly that he was, etc. So we have the 6 requirements of all sutras, which is faith, hearer, time, host, place, and audience. So these are the 6 requirements that we'll see in the very beginning of all sutras. And this is something that kind of helps us designate a sutra versus other texts in Buddhism, because sometimes we'll come across, especially in the Abhidharma, or the Buddhist psychology part of the 3 baskets of the Tripitaka. Those are mostly filled with more elaborate or detailed text of sutras, so they're not by the Buddha, but by other enlightened beings or disciples. There's also commentary, there's also treatises, etc. So all those texts don't begin with "thus I have heard," right? So they're not considered sutras. And so when we read a legitimate sutra, it must have all these 6 requirements. And so for at least the Amitabha Sutra, again, any sutra, has, thus I have heard, at one time the Buddha dwelt at Shravasi, in the Jeta Grove, in the garden of the benefactor, orphans, and the solitary, together with a gathering of great bhikshus, 1,250 in all great arahats, whom the assembly knew and recognized, etc., etc. Of the Amitabha Sutra. Oops. So in this case, thus fulfills the requirement of faith. And I'll go into it a little bit later in a bit. I'll describe a little bit, I'll go in detail of all three requirements, but I just want to point out which one is which. So thus fulfills the requirement of faith. And then I have heard, fulfills the requirement of hearer of this. And then at one time fulfills the requirement of time. And Buddha is the host, obviously, he's hosting the sutra, or the discussion. And Shravasti in the Jeta Grove fulfills the requirement of place. And a gathering of great, and the, audience is the gathering of great bhikshus. What am I missing? I'm missing one, aren't I? No, I'm not. Okay. I'm miscounting myself. Okay. So again, all sutras, both in Theravada and in Mahayana traditions, all legitimate sutras begin with thus I have heard. So thus again fulfills the requirement of faith. I have heard fulfills the requirement of hearer. At one time fulfills the requirement of time. The Buddha fulfills the requirement of host. And Shravasti, the Jeta Grove, fulfills the requirement of place. And the gathering of great bhikshus is the audience, and that fulfills that requirement. And so beginning with faith, right? So thus is the kind of designation that we see in the Buddhist text that kind of points us to like the orthodoxy of the sutra. Because there are a lot of sutras that came after the Buddha was enlightened and passed into nirvana that were created, especially in some Mahayana sutras, right, were created or assembled after the Buddha had passed. But most Mahayana sutras were actually originally come from the orthodox sutras already that it was existed. They were just elaborated a little bit more after the Buddha had passed. So that's why in the Mahayana canon of text, there's thousands and thousands of them, and they're much longer than the ones in the Theravada tradition, because the council of the Buddhist council after he had passed, or once Mahayana was kind of established, and the ideal of the Bodhisattva was kind of born, right? They took those sutras and just elaborated a little bit more on their teachings and their practices. But they still maintain the same script of thus I have heard. And so thus is coming from Ananda. Thus I have heard comes from Ananda. And Ananda was the Buddha's main attendant and also his cousin. And Ananda was proficient in the teachings. He had a photographic memory. So he was able to actually capture and be with the Buddha until the day he passed and listen to all the sutras that he gave. And so Ananda memorized them. So during the first first Buddhist council, which happened a little bit after the Buddha's passing, it was Ananda that provided the sutras to the remaining council to be verified. And so when he says, I have heard, Ananda's saying that he personally heard the Buddha give this teaching. And so the use of thus I have heard comes from the instruction given to Ananda by the Buddha before the Buddha passed into nirvana. So this leads us to the 4 questions that Ananda had for the Buddha, and it's just named Ananda's 4 questions, right? So it's this special occasion. And this has happened when the Buddha was, the night the Buddha knew that he was about to pass into nirvana, he announced to the assembly that tonight I will pass in the middle of the night, I'm going to enter nirvana. And so when Ananda heard this, he started to really cry heavily, and he was very attached to the Buddha. And at this point, Ananda had not attained arhatship yet. He was not fully enlightened yet. But he loved the Buddha so much and had an attachment to be with the Buddha that he was just inconsolable. And then another monk, Aniruddha, who is one of the oldest monks in age in the assembly, kind of came over and one time and was like, "Why are you crying?" And I was like, "The Buddha is about to die. What do you mean? Why am I crying?" Right? And so Aniruddha was trying to calm him down, be like, "Okay, well, calm yourself, because there's more pressing matters to be discussed. There's more important things that we need to talk about before the Buddha passes into nirvana." And Ananda asked him, what's more important than the Buddha passing? And then Aniruddha told Ananda that he should go ask the Buddha 4 extremely important matters which must be settled. And so then Ananda asked Aniruddha, what are these matters? And these are the 4 questions. The first question is, the first question that Ananda was going to ask the Buddha was, how should we begin all sutras? What is the beginning text of all sutras? With what words should we begin each sutra, to be exact? The second question is that we have taken the Buddha as our teacher, as our master, but once the Buddha passes into nirvana, to whom should become our next teacher? Who should be our next leader? And I think it was Ananda who kind of suggested that maybe we should take Mahakashyapa as the next master. The third question is, now that we live with the Buddha, but when the Buddha goes into nirvana, where will we live? And the fourth and last question is, the Buddha can discipline evil-natured bhikshus or monks, but after he goes into nirvana, how should we take care of them? And so Ananda, these are questions that Aniruddha told Ananda to go ask the Buddha. And so Ananda agreed and like, yeah, these are very important questions, you're right. And so he kind of wiped his face with tears and put himself together and went to the Buddha and asked the Buddha, World Honor One, before you pass into nirvana, please have compassion upon us and answer these questions. And the Buddha asked, what were your questions? And so then Ananda recited the questions to the Buddha. And of course, the first question was, you have spoken many sutras. When we compile and edit them, what words should we begin? Or what words should they begin with? And the Buddha told him that all sutras spoken by the Buddhas in all 10 directions, in past, present, and future, always begin with the words, thus I have heard, which means that the Dharma in which thus can be believed that I personally heard it. Meaning Ananda personally heard these words spoken from the Buddha's mouth. And Ananda then asked him the second question and said that you are our master, but when you enter nirvana, who will be our teacher? Please instruct us, should it be Mahakashyapa? And the Buddha said, no, that when I go into nirvana, take the pratimoksha, the precepts as your master, as your teacher, in accord with the Buddha's teachings, or instructions, and said that those who leave home life, must first receive the precepts. The third question then is, we have always lived with the Buddha, but when you enter nirvana, where will we live? Or where are we going to live? And the Buddha told him, when I enter nirvana, all bhikshus, bhikshunis, upasakas, and upasikas, monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen, should dwell in the 4 applications of mindfulness, or the 4 foundations of mindfulness that we are now discussing in the meditation class, of body, feelings, mind, and objects of mind. The fourth question that Ananda asked the Buddha was, how should we treat evil-natured bhikshus? And I love this answer because the answer is very straightforward, and it's something that I would also say? And the Buddha basically told Ananda, that's not a problem. That's not a problem. You simply just ignore them. I'm like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. That's probably what we should all do, right? But that's essentially what he says, that simply be silent and they will go away. This is the quote that he gives, that fight evil people with concentration power. Don't be moved by them, because if they are evil, don't be evil in return. If a mad dog bites you and you bite him back, you're just a dog yourself. So evil-natured people are born with a bad temper. All you can do is ignore them, and they will soon lose interest and leave. And we can also, even outside of sutras or outside of monks and nuns, this applies to us anyway, right? Is a lot of time, and we can recognize this when people are being evil-natured toward us, right? People are being difficult, or Karens, right? Or trying to cause a scene, or try to just stir drama. And the best thing we can do is to be silent, or to just go back to the breathing, or go back to your breathing and just let them go on, right? Because most time they are just trying to get a reaction out of you. And so as long as you don't give them what they want, they're just going to be bored and lose interest and move on, right? So we essentially have to do the same with evil-hearted, evil-natured bhikshus. So those are the 6 requirements and the 4 questions of Ananda. Now, the reason why Ananda, or the Buddha told Ananda to use "thus I have heard," is to resolve 3 types of doubts. The first one is to distinguish Buddhist sutras from the writings of other religions or non-Buddhist religions in India, to resolve the doubts of the assembly, and to end the assembly's debates. So back in even still today, but in most, at least in the Vedic or the Brahmin tradition, right, in India, all their sutras, right, their discourses always start with the letters A or O, which indicates existence or non-existence, right? Because to them, everything is either existent or doesn't exist, right? Because they can go on and be like, in the beginning there was, where was it? What's the quote he gives? In the beginning there wasn't anything, but now there is, right? And so they are unable to go beyond existence and non-existence, right? They're not able to see true emptiness, which is what the Buddha teaches us. So things aren't simply just existence or non-existence, right? It's existence, non-existence, and existence within non-existence, and non-existence within existence, which is complicated. But if we see the kind of the formula the Buddha put together for us, it's just trying to help us recognize and realize emptiness. That things aren't just black and white. They don't just exist and don't exist, right? There's something kind of in between. And so we are able to go beyond just something that exists or not exists. The second doubt was to resolve the doubts of the assembly. And so the Buddha knew that once he would pass away, that the disciples, or whether lay or monastic, would have some doubts, right? And so while Ananda and Mahakashyapa were editing the sutras, right, Ananda sat on the Dharma seat, and this is when he was reciting the sutras. At this point, Ananda had already attained arahatship. So sometime after the Buddha passed, Ananda went into a cave and meditated for, I don't know how long he meditated for, but he eventually attained arahatship. So he's fully enlightened at this point. He was also the youngest fully enlightened monastic in the monastery. And people would have had doubts about him kind of reciting the sutras or acting acting in place of the Buddha because he was so young and he's just freshly enlightened, right? That people would have doubt as to would have doubts in his teachings, right? Would have doubts in his recollection of the Buddha's teaching. And so when Ananda was in the council about to speak the sutras, right? He sat in meditation and went into samadhi, right? So deep meditative concentration state. And it's said that those that are in true samadhi form have this kind of aura or glow around them, right? Because they're in glow or aura around them. And so this gave this kind of this action gave the assembly a little bit of doubts, it raised 3 doubts. The first doubt was that some thought that the Buddha hadn't really gone into nirvana, that he was still alive, and Ananda was kind of the resurrection of the Buddha. The second doubt is that Shakyamuni Buddha had already entered nirvana, and now this is a different Buddha from a different time and place to kind of replace him. And the third doubt was that they thought that Ananda himself had realized Buddhahood. And so as Ananda was sitting in meditation and he was in some deep samadhi, the assembly had these 3 doubts. And it wasn't until Ananda said, "Thus I have heard." And as soon as he said that, then everyone knew that Shakyamuni Buddha didn't come back, that this isn't another Buddha from somewhere else out there, and that Ananda himself was not a Buddha, right? Because he's saying, "Thus I have heard." And so the Dharma, which is thus, is that which Ananda personally heard from Shakyamuni Buddha. The third doubt was to end the assembly's doubts. So again, because Ananda was the youngest amongst the monks at the temple, at the monastery, he knew that it was very likely that people would believe him, right? Again, he's young, he's super young, he's freshly enlightened because he's surrounded by older monks who've been already arhats, who've been fully enlightened for years, right? But as soon as he said, "Thus I have heard," everyone knew that these words were not Ananda's principles, they're not the assembly's principles, that these were the Buddha's direct teachings and instructions, and that they personally came from the Buddha, and that Ananda personally heard them from the Buddha. So it's not our teaching, it's not your teaching, this is the Buddha's teaching. And so that kind of silenced the assembly's doubts. So that's that. I try to find a little bit more information about these 6 requirements in my expansive library, but I was not able to find any more information other than my own commentary, which I don't even know where I got it from, to be honest. But at least we know, because I was speaking to Quang last night, that and the question the question that came up was, what if a new sutra was found and buried inside of a cave, right? And it had, "Thus I have heard," such blah, 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 right? How do we know that this was a true sutra? How do we know this is a legitimate sutra? And there's a couple ways that we can figure this out in a simplistic, logical sense. And also depends on the type of sutra itself. As I mentioned earlier, in the Mahayana sutras there's way more Mahayana sutras than there are Theravada sutras, right? And so a lot of the Mahayana sutras, again, they're just expansion packs from original sutras, right? And so there are some orthodox sutras, right, from the Pali Canon, right? These are legitimate sutras from the Buddha. that the Mahayanas took and either A, expanded on that sutra, or took the main topics of the sutra and made separate sutras and elaborating on that piece. For instance, let's say the Sutra on the Six Perfections, right? Or the Four Noble Truths, or the Eightfold Path, right? So instead of making one very large sutra, they cut it into pieces to make smaller sutras, right? So that's one way, that's one reason why the Mahayanas have so many more sutras, right? They're just expansion packs on original sutras. The second way we can validate this is because everything does come from the Pali Canon, right? And the Pali Canon has been passed down and uninterrupted since the time of the Buddha. We have a full list of all sutras that were created in that canon, right? So we have a complete list of sutra titles and sutra names. We may not have in existence all of them, but we know that these are the ones that are existing, that are true in the Pali Canon. And so if it's not on this list, or not in the Abhidharma part, not in the commentary, not in a treatise, or anything like that, then we can kind of have an educated guess that this may or may not be legitimate. But there are other sutras nowadays, especially in Mahayana, I don't want to say sutras, texts that are considered sutras, because if we remember back in the first or second class of this, right, I mentioned that there's only a specific types of beings that can create sutras, right, that can have the authority to make a sutra. And one of those beings is an enlightened disciple of the Buddha. So, for example, one of the sutras that novices learn first is the Sutra on the 42 chapters. 42 chapters. And this sutra was written by an enlightened monk back in somewhere a long time ago. So this text isn't a text from the Buddha, but because this monk was fully enlightened and he created this text, that the Mahayanas considered this a form of a sutra, right? Because an enlightened being had created it or had written it. Some other texts that we would see are like a treatises, right? So there's the treatise of the perfection of wisdom that's written by Nagarjuna, who is also the principal monk who kind of developed the middle path tradition, specifically the Madhyamaka tradition. There's also commentary in the Tripitaka and the Abhidharma section, which are commentary from enlightened beings, enlightened monks and nuns. What other types of texts are there? That's pretty much it. So there's treatises, there's commentary. There's also a few other things I can't remember right now, but anyway. But these are also texts that don't necessarily fall under the category of sutra, but are enough or closely related to sutras or to the true essence of the Dharma, where they're still considered valuable, influential text. The other thing that we have to also consider, especially in Mahayana sutras, because again, Mahayana sutras are some of them are newer, or expansions, that another way we can recognize the legitimacy of the sutra is essentially just read the sutra and see what the essence of that sutra is teaching, right? Because the Buddha, all of Buddha's Dharma, all his sutras have the same goal, right? They all have the same final destination, which is to eradicate our suffering and attain enlightenment, right? So every single sutra that we read or that we recite and chant Every single one is an instruction manual of how we can eradicate suffering and attain enlightenment, right? So that way, because we know that, and we can follow the kind of the journey of a sutra, that if the sutra doesn't follow that same journey of trying to help us to eradicate suffering and attain enlightenment, then we can, as an educated guest, say, this is not a legitimate sutra. This is talking about how we can get away with murder or something. I don't know. Right? So we can know this is not a legitimate text. And so it's also important that when we read sutras, and now since we're in a modern day and everything's kind of digitized and the canons are pretty solid, there's not really much room for second guessing sutras and discourses because they're all pretty foundational already. So fortunately, we don't really have to worry about that. But still, there's a lot of sutras that we know historically were written either hundreds of years after the Buddha passed, or even as far back as the 1, 2, 300 CE, right? Like the Shurangama Sutra, for instance, which is a very large, very important sutra. But we know historically that this sutra was compiled around 128-ish, year 128 AD. And so we know it didn't come directly from the Buddha's words, right, Buddha's mouth, but the teaching of the sutra still follows the same blueprint of his original teachings, right, of the orthodox teachings. And so that though it may not be a direct teaching, it is still considered part of the essence of the Buddha's teaching, right? It still fulfills the essence of the journey of our practice. It still fulfills the desire to eradicate suffering, to end our defilements, to cleanse the defilements, to purify our minds, to attain enlightenment. So it still follows the same structure. And so we would consider it a legitimate sutra. I think that's actually one of the latest sutras. All other sutras, for the most part, like the Amitabha Sutra, I think it's dated just a few hundred years after the Buddha's passing, along with the Diamond Sutra. It's also one of the earliest ever, or the oldest ever discovered sutra was the Diamond Sutra. It was also one of the very first historically sutras that were found in written format. I think it was found in a cave in China somewhere, but it is historically in the world the oldest written manuscript, which I think it's pretty awesome that it's a Buddhist text versus something else. And so we can thankfully kind of historically go back in time and find the time frames of a lot of these sutras. And I know a lot of scholars have doubts or are kind of uneasy about some of the later editions of sutras that weren't really part of the original canon. And I'm kind of like 50-50 on that as well, especially with the Shurangama Sutra. I'm not necessarily a big fan of. I know we have to chant it in the morning for our services, but I mean, I haven't read the full sutra itself because, again, it's ginormous, and in the at least the version that I have, the paper's like paper thin. It's basically see-through, right? So imagine this thin paper, thinner than like a little strand of hair. It's all flimsy. It's literally see-through, right? And it's like a book this big. So it's a huge, huge book. I was like, I'm not gonna read this. No, I'm not gonna read this. I have better things to do with my time. But I know the essence of the sutra, and I know the kind of the specific teachings that are in the sutra. And so one of the reasons why I don't really feel a connection with it is because the sutra itself has a lot of main points, right? the biggest point that is relied on, especially in monasteries for monks and nuns, is because of again, it has the 5, we don't chant the whole sutra in the morning, but we chant the 5 sections of mantras. There's 5 mantra sections. And these are the longest mantras in all Buddhist text. And these 5 mantras is what's chanted in the morning. And these 5 mantras were given to Ananda, who was going out for alms, right? And this is a story in the sutra of how and when these mantras were given. Is when Ananda was going out into the village seeking alms, and again, Ananda was a very handsome man, supposedly. Everybody wanted Ananda, right? I'm like, okay, good luck with that. But anyway, for some reason, Ananda was out almsing all by himself, which is something that the Buddha discouraged to do, right? It's like, if you're going to go out into the world, always at least try to take one other monk with you. But anyway, so then I was walking down, giving alms, and then from afar, this beautiful lady saw Ananda, and she was like, and she's seen Ananda before, and she's like, oh my God, I really want Ananda. Like, we need to get married, right, and have babies like ASAP. But of course, Ananda was like, no thanks. You do you, I'm gonna do me. But anyway, so supposedly there were many attempts by this woman to try to persuade Ananda to go over to the other side, but thankfully Ananda always shut her down. And so she got so desperate that she employed her mother, who was some kind of witch, supposedly, and she cast a spell on Ananda to lure him in. So according to the story, the spell worked, and he got lured into the house and was persuaded, or not persuaded, was seduced by the woman, and other things happened. And on the verge of him breaking that celibacy precept, the Buddha, from wherever he was, saw what was happening in his Buddha mind, Buddha eye. He's like, oh no, what's happening now? And so then he sent, I think it was Shariputra or Manjushri, I'm not sure who, but he sent one of the disciples to Ananda to give him these 5 mantras. And then whomever it was, I think it was Shariputra or Manjushri, somebody, found Ananda and reminded him to be mindful of the Buddha and gave him these 5 mantras. And then that broke the spell, right, essentially. And then a teaching had happened, which I guess persuaded the mom and the woman to also leave the home life, and so they became nuns as well. So at least something good came out of this craziness. But that's essentially the reason why we chant the Shrangama mantras, is to have that remembrance, the recollection of the Buddha, to assuage any of those sensual desires that we may have. And that's only like one part of the sutra. And then the 5 other million pages goes over the Bodhisattva path, the way of the Bodhisattva, its perfections, the levels of the Bodhisattvahood, or levels of enlightenment of a Bodhisattva into Buddhahood. And so there's a plethora of other teachings there as well. And so to me, I never connected with it, because I was like, I can get all that from other sutras that are shorter and easier to read and memorize and to understand. And so I use the Diamond Sutra in lieu of the Shrangama Sutra. They're essentially the same. I know a lot of people would disagree, but it's not my problem. But anyway, I'm so off topic. Why did I even bring that up? Now I forgot. Oh yeah, the legitimacy of the sutra. Yeah, so Yeah, and so since the Shrangama Sutra was made a couple hundred years after the Buddha, right, some scholars believe that it's not a legitimate sutra, but because it contains all the core and essence of the Buddhist teachings, nothing is outside of that. It's not saying anything false, right? It's not rewording the Buddha's teachings or the Dharma. It's not deducting anything. It's not really adding anything new. And so because of that, and because it falls under those categories, or falls under those qualifications and the requirements, that we consider it a sutra, a legitimate sutra. But whether it is or not, it's still worthy of praise and veneration. So if anybody is courageous enough to read that sutra, good luck. Good luck. So other than the chapter of the 5 mantras, there's also a chapter, I can't remember what chapter number it is, I think it's either 27 or 28, that has some of the Bhadra's aspirations, 10 aspirations, when we chant that sutra often here. And so that in itself is considered a sutra, right? So there's a lot of chapters in the Shrangama Sutra that we've taken out and created its own sutra, right? And so the deeds of Samantabhadra is one. Another chapter is on the 10 grounds, the 10 abodes of the Bodhisattva. 10 abodes of the Bodhisattva are the levels of the Bodhisattvahood, the levels of enlightenment of the Bodhisattva, which are 10. That's also taken out of that sutra to create its own sutra. So this is what I mean before, right? For larger sutras that came from the Pali Canon, and we've taken out and kind of separated into smaller pieces to be able to easily digest them more easily. And so that's one of the reasons why we have thousands and thousands of more sutras in the Theravada tradition. And so even those, the only thing that we may not see though in those types of sutras that have been taken out of other sutras is the 6 requirements that we may not see, right? Because it's not a beginning of a sutra. This is only applicable to the very beginning of a sutra. And so if we look in our chant book for the Samantabhadra, aspirations of Samantabhadra, it doesn't have the 6 requirements, right? Because it's not a beginning of that sutra. It's taken from a larger sutra, right? And so we have to be able to recognize that too. So if you pick up what you think is a sutra, and you don't see the requirements, it can either A, not be a real sutra, or B, it's taken from another sutra. So it's not going to have the 6 requirements because it's not a beginning of a sutra. It's taken from the middle or from the end or whatever it may be. And so in Mahayana, we see that quite often. So it's not necessarily a surprise, but it's also, again, this is why it's important. This is why I went over in the last 5 classes of the types of sutras, the definitions, the divisions, the categories, what to expect, what to see, how to recognize them. All that information is important. That way, when we do get a sutra like the Aspiration Samantabhadra that doesn't include the 6 requirements, we can have an educated guest and kind of go over it and for ourselves conclude whether this is legitimate or not, right? So I didn't spend the last 5 classes telling you all information for nothing, right? whether you take it and you use it and you apply it into your sutra study or not, that information is important to know. That when we do get sutras like the Samantabhadra or the 10 grounds of the Bodhisattva, what others are there? There's also the sutra of the questions of Manjushri. There's a lot of other texts that we use that are legitimate sutras, but they are taken from other larger sutras. So that doesn't have the 6 requirements. So it can be perceived as illegitimate, right? If we aren't aware of where they came from. Okay, that's it. So that's the first half of the first section of the sutra. So we covered the 6 requirements. Then our next class, we'll discuss the second part. So we discussed today, thus I have heard, right? At one time the Buddha. That's pretty much what we covered today. In Shavasana in the Jeta Grove. And so next class, we'll talk about the Garden of the Benefactor of Orphans and the Solitary, because there's a whole story behind that, and who is the benefactor of orphans and the solitary. And then after that, we'll go into the, because again, it's not the whole first section. It's still missing all the names of the 16 arhats and the other bodhisattvas. So after the story of the garden, we'll go through all of the 16 arhats and talk about them, talk about their story, their life, how they attained enlightenment, how they became disciples of the Buddha. Because we'll see a lot of those names in other sutras, right? A lot of these names were mentioned in other sutras. Of course, the most common names we see are Ananda, Shariputra, Manjushri. Who else usually? Subhuti is one from the Diamond Sutra. That's pretty much it for the most part. But we'll see other names as supporting characters, right? Like the bodhisattvas. Because even the Amitabha Sutra, Avalokiteshvara, and Mahasamaprapta, right? Great Strength Bodhisattva and Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva are mentioned in the Amitabha Sutras, not in the shorter one, but in the longer one, in the concentration meditation one. Even in the Lotus Sutra, we'll see dozens of different names of arhats and bodhisattvas as well. And so sometimes it's just good to know who they are, right? Even though their stories may be long, sometimes some of these stories are actually very humorous to me. We'll get to a story of a couple of brothers in here and a couple of cousins. And their stories are kind of funny. And so it's just good to know who these beings are, who these people are, right? That way, when you see them, you're able to recognize them. They're not just another name. They're not just another word, but you know who and what they are. That way, there's at least for me, when I know that information, it helps me be a little bit more connected to the discourse, right? Especially knowing who they are and what they are, it also helps you kind of remember them, right? Because I can go through the full short Amitabha Sutra by memory. We chant it so often. The name of the 16 arhats, I can recognize them anywhere, right? And so when you have that recognition, it's easy to recollect who they are, recollect their stories. That way you can tell people, explain it to people, right? And it just makes things easier, I suppose, at least for me. Okay, questions, concerns, emotional outbursts. Mm-hmm.
Is the Amitabha Sutra a Theravada or a Mahayana?
It is definitely a Mahayana Sutra.
So is it a recollection of a Theravada one, or is this purely Mahayana?
This is purely Mahayana. It is purely Mahayana, and we can know that's purely Mahayana because of the Theravada ideal, right? So in Theravada Buddhism, they don't not believe in other Buddhas, but they don't really care about other Buddhas except for the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, right? So they know other Buddhas exist, like the Amitabha Buddha, right? They acknowledge other Buddhas in other realms and other worlds, etc., as well as bodhisattvas. but they're not concerned with them because that has nothing to do with their practice. They're only concerned with historical Buddha Shakyamuni and his 10 main disciples, or the 16 arhats in this case. And so in Theravada Buddhism, the sutra, we don't have sutras specifically for, in Theravada Buddhism, they don't have sutras specifically for other Buddhas, like Amitabha Buddha, or the Medicine Buddha, or sutras like on Kshitigarbha Bodhisattva or Shvada Bodhisattva. They don't have any of that, right? They acknowledge them, they know they exist, they know it's mentioned in their sutras, but they don't have an expansion of sutras like the Mahayanas do. So Buddha Amitabha is mentioned, but it's not mentioned in a way that Mahayana mentions it, if that makes any sense, right? So in Theravada Buddhism, the way he's mentioned is because they're mentioning names of Buddhas in the past, right? And mentioning names of disciples or monks or nuns that have attained Buddhahood, right? So they're listing names, and one of those names happened to be Amitabha. But it wasn't until toward the end of the Buddha's life where he started to expand on the higher teachings, right? Meaning the teachings of the Bodhisattva path and the Buddhahood path, right? Because he spent the majority of his life teaching just the core foundational teachings, Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, and the 12 links of dependent origination, right? Those teachings on itself allow you to become an arhat, fully enlightened being. And so once they were became arhatship, they're like, okay, we're good. We don't need anything else. Like we're done. We're gonna pass away and never have to think about rebirth ever again. But then toward the end of Buddha's life, he's like, well, I know you're kind of settled in arhatship, but there's actually more that you can do. You can actually attain now to bodhisattvahood, and you're even capable of attaining Buddhahood too, right? And so he gave the bodhisattva teachings. He gave the other teachings of other Buddhas and bodhisattvas, but the arhats were like, no, we're good, right? Not all of them. Some of them were like, you know what, that sounds a little shabby. I'm gonna try that out. And so those that accepted it, right, continued that lineage after the Buddha had passed, and then elaborated on those other Buddhas and bodhisattvas, and that's where Amitabha Sutra was born. That's where the Medicine Buddha Sutra was born, and all the other sutras that include or speak of Buddhas or bodhisattvas outside of historical figures. Good question. Any other questions? Yeah, the Pure Land, the Pure Land school is very much lay-based for the most part, right? It was a type of practice specifically, it was originated specifically for lay people, according to historical stuff. It was intended for lay people to help them use the concentration or the mindfulness of Amitabha Buddha in their daily life to keep that mindfulness of the Buddha throughout their day, right? So in the Pure Land school or Pure Land tradition, literally the main, like 90% of your practice is just reciting Amitabha's name, Namo Amitabha Buddha, or just Amitabha, right? To recollect him and keep him in your mind. And they do that in the same way that we concentrate on our breath when we meditate, right? As your object of meditation is your breath. So that's all you focus on. And there is very little room for distractions to arise, very little room for your mind to create stories and entertain this and entertain that, and your mind's over there and your body's here. And so reciting Amitabha's name is a form of meditation. And it is a form of honing that concentration, that focus on only Amitabha Buddha. And so it's kind of like an easy way to practice, right? And so, of course, through the sutras, it's telling you, if you recite the Buddha's name, if you practice with sincerity, and with genuine faith, then you'll be reborn in Amitabha's land of ultimate bliss, and from there you can attain full enlightenment. But yeah, it's. I mean, there are whole monasteries specifically just for Pure Land school, right? It's a very popular tradition in China and Vietnam and Japan too. But it's only in China and Vietnam that the Pure Land is a monastic tradition. In Japan, it's not. In Japan, they've created traditions that are for and by lay people, and it has to do with a few different things that occurred in Japan and in Japan's history. And one of them is, I don't know what emperor it was, but there was one emperor, I guess they were going on war, they didn't have enough soldiers in their army to help fight. And so he forbade anyone, because people would ordain as monks and nuns to avoid military service. And so the emperor at the time forbade anyone from ordaining until they went through military service and did their duty to the country, right? And so that happened, and then after a while, I guess, he changed it again. The emperor changed the rules again. Like, you know what? I guess it was because people weren't populating more people, babies or something, right? So he gave permission to these monks to marry and have kids. And so that, of course, breaks down the whole path of a monastic, right? And so Japan, even Japan to this day, has a very small percentage of true monasticism. There's only a couple of schools that are true monastics, that follow the true monastic lifestyle. Instead, now they have priests. And these priests are not true monastics, right? They only take the 14 bodhisattva vows as their precepts, and which is incomplete, because the bodhisattva vows are, there's the 14 core vows, and then separate from that, there are the 10 major vows and 48 minor vows. That in its entirety is the bodhisattva path, but they only take the 14 vows, which doesn't forbid them from marrying or even eating meat or drinking. So that kind of literally defeats the whole purpose. So I don't recognize these priests as monastics. I would not give them that designation, nor will I ever. I think that's just ingenuine to the path. But most of those types of traditions fall into two categories: the Pure Land, and they actually do have a Tian Tai, right? We have, our tradition here is Tian Dai, right? That originated from China, and it follows the Lotus Sutra as its main sutra, and then the Amitabha Sutra as its secondary, and the Parinirvana Sutra as its support. The Tian Tai is essentially the same, but it's a Japanese version. And it was created by, or it was restructured by, I can't remember the monk's name at the moment, but it still follows the same core teachings, right? They still take the Lotus Sutra and the Amitabha Sutra as their main teachings. but they are not monastics. So, yeah, I have issues with that. Clearly, that defeats the whole purpose. But anyway, any other questions? Sorry, I'm a little hoarse tonight. Need some hot tea. Okay, if there are no other questions, then we will transfer the merits in today's class. Namo Shakyamuni Buddha. Namo Shakyamuni Buddha. Namo Shakyamuni Buddha. Any positive karmic action we've accumulated here today, we wish to transfer the merit to all sentient beings and wish them for alignment. Namo Shakyamuni.